There has been some confusion over how to adjust these HDR calibration screens on the Sony PS5 since my mouse more or less video yesterday. So I thought this would be a good time for me to explain what this HDR calibration screen means and show you some objective measurements of the digital code values, and also advise you on how to adjust them for the best picture quality on your own TV or display. So there are three screens here, as you can see, and the first screen allows us to set the maximum full frame tone map luminance. So what this means is that, when the whole screen is very bright, then you are telling the HGIG compliant game and also the console at what peak brightness level your display will start clipping the specular highlight detail. And the next screen would be the adjustment for maximum tone map luminance. This is a 10% window, so you're telling the HGIG compliant game and also the console at what peak brightness level you will start clipping specular highlight detail. And then the third screen would allow you to adjust the minimum tone map luminance. This will allow you to tell the HGIG game and also the console at what minimum luminance level you'll start to clip shadow detail. So let's go back to the first screen, and what I wanted to first show you is the waveform on the screen. I'm using a Canon DP-V2411 reference broadcast monitor. I believe this currently costs more than 5 figures, but it has an excellent HDR analysis toolkit which allows us to analyze various elements on screen. So if I can bring up the waveform monitor, and I will also bring up the pixel value checker as well. So wherever this cursor goes, it will tell us the digital code value. Because this is in HDR10, this is PQ digital code value, and also the peak brightness where the cursor lies. So if I actually move the cursor slightly to the white bit, you can see that it goes all the way up to 10,000 nits with a digital PQ code value of 1023, which is the maximum in RGB terms. And if I go back down to the sun, you can see that currently it is sitting at a digital code value of 640 and generating around 300 nits. So what I'm going to do now is to go all the way down to the darkest level, where you can't go any darker for the sun. And you can see here that the digital code value is somewhere in between 527 and 528, giving us a peak brightness of 108 nits, which is roughly equivalent to the peak brightness of a Dolby Digital Cinema projector. And if we go up by 9 clicks from the darkest value, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you can see that it is around 400 nits. And then if we go up to steps 15 from the darkest level, so 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I founded HDTV Test 13 years, 10 months and 10 days ago, and I never thought that one day I'll be doing this. But who's counting, eh? So at level 15, by level 15 I mean 15 clicks from the darkest level, you can see that the peak brightness is just under 1000 nits. But this Canon monitor is actually capable of 1000 nits, and it is clipping it slightly, to my eyes. So if we go up even further, you can see that, it goes up to 1100 nits, then 1300 nits, 1500 nits, 1700 nits, and then all the way up to 10,000 nits. And then this will allow you to tell the game and the console at what level the specular highlight detail will start disappearing. Now here's the thing, we are concerned about the peak brightness measurements below 1000 nits, because let's be honest here, most consumer displays are under 1000 nits, especially for OLED displays, which most of you probably will be interested in. So my opinion is that the adjustments on the Sony PS5 is far too crude for an exact level. So by that, I will try and explain what I mean. If you look at level 15, it is around 980 nits. And the reason why it is fluctuating is because, this test pattern is probably rendered in full RGB, and then it has to go through lots of conversion process, maybe to YCBCR, to RGB, and then to limited and stuff, and then there will be rounding errors, which is why it is slightly fluctuating on screen, especially when the Canon display is trying to process it and then to spit out a value for us to analyze. So I'm not surprised that it is fluctuating very slightly. So let's, for the sake of argument, say that this is a code value of 768, which corresponds to a peak brightness of 985 nits. Now, if we go one step down from 15, which is 14, obviously, then you can see that the code value is somewhere in between 751 to 752. But the peak brightness has dropped to around 850 nits. This means that there is more than 100 nits of difference between steps 14 and 15. You can see that this is 980 nits for the sake of argument, and then this is 850 nits. So there is more than 100 nits of difference. And then if we go one step down, this is around, say, 740 nits. Again, more than 100 nits of difference. And then if we go one step down, 640 nits, there is still around, say, 80, 90 nits of difference. So I think, these adjustment levels are too crude. That's the reason why I believe you should actually clip it slightly. Let's say on this display, which is 1000 nits, if I actually follow the instructions on screen, which says that to adjust the brightness until the symbol is barely visible, now I need to go one step down to level 14. But to me, this sun here is quite visible. I wouldn't call it barely visible. But if I settle at this level, I will be telling the HGIG compliant game and also the console that I can only resolve highlight detail up to 850 nits, which is not the case because, this display is capable of 1000 nits, which hard clips at 1000 nits. But if you actually settle at a lower level, where the sun is visible, what you are doing is to actually tell the console and the HGIG compliant game that you are only capable of resolving 850 nits and the game will only output 850 nits. And I think you are losing out on a lot. You're leaving a lot of peak brightness on the table. So I believe that it is better to hard clip it, the level at which the sun just disappears. And this is in line with the official documentation that has been put out by the HGIG organization themselves on their website. If you look at this document here, they are saying that you should adjust the slider until the gray squares just disappear. Just disappear. That means that, when it starts clipping. So I believe that this should be the case for all HGIG compliant display because, you are hard clipping anything above. You should actually try and set this logo until it just disappears. And if you really want to actually go for a level where you can just see it being barely visible, you can do that as well. Then I think you won't be losing out by much. But when I say barely visible, you need to make sure that the logo is very, very faint before you're sure to set it on that level. Otherwise, you'll be losing out on additional peak brightness that the game can generate for you. So you need to make sure that the logo is very, very faint. And I'm talking fainter than the pink line on the pregnancy test presented by your mistress. She's convinced she's pregnant. You're not convinced? I am not speaking from personal experience, of course. But yes, you need to make sure that your symbol or your sun is very, very faint before setting on that level. If it is very obvious, as is the case on this Canon monitor, then I think it is better to just go over and clip it. That means that you will tell the game that your display is capable of a slightly higher peak brightness. You may lose out on some very minor specular highlight detail, but again, the majority of your tonal range will be slightly brighter, will be preserved, and that will be beneficial to some of you who will be thinking that your HDR games are too dark as well. So that is that, and then we'll go to the next screen again. This should be the same value between the first screen and the next screen, they should be the exact same value, in terms of where it clips and in terms of where it is just barely visible. So you can see here that I'm still sitting at under 1000 nits when it starts clipping. And unless you have a display that is actually doing some weird dynamic tone mapping, then the maximum full frame tone map luminance and also the maximum tone map luminance should be identical. And then if we go to the next bit, which is the minimum tone map luminance, then I firmly believe that you should leave this on the lowest level, the darkest level that you can go, because as you can see from the waveform at the bottom left corner, if you leave it on the darkest level, and also from the pixel value checker, if you go for the darkest level, you'll be telling the game and also the console that your black floor is 0, which is a good thing. 0 nits is true blacks, especially when you have an OLED display. But if you go up even by one step, then you can see that the black floor has raised to 0.00221 candelas per square meter, which corresponds to a PQ code value of 10 RGB. So I think, if you settle on this, then maybe there would be some HGIG compliant games that will think that, we need to set the black floor at this level, and you may experience near black flickering, you may experience, say, floating blacks, your blacks not looking inky black, especially with some displays, LEDs, they shut down their LEDs when they encounter a digital clock value of 0, but if it's not 0, then they won't shut off their backlight. And also maybe OLEDs, they are more sensitive than a female clitoris to near black changes, so you may see more flickering artifacts, macro blocking, near black chrominance overshoot, things like that if you actually set this too high. I think the reason why this screen is here is for people who are playing HDR games or watching HDR movies in non-reference environment. By non-reference environment, I mean that you are actually playing these HDR games in a brighter environment. Then you may need some help from the game and the display and the console to lift the shadow detail slightly. Then you can obviously go up the scale. But if you are playing HDR games in a pitch black room or in a reference HDR condition, by reference HDR condition, I mean, with an ambient light brightness that doesn't exceed 5 nits, which is very, very dark. And that's how actually HDR content should be consumed. I keep reading comments about people complaining that HDR is too dark, HDR movies are too dark, HDR games are too dark. And the reason is because probably you are watching in a brighter environment. And the thing to realize with HDR content is that, HDR is absolute. PQ is absolute, so there is no room to manipulate the PQ EOTF gamma without actually destroying the creator's intent. So if you want to actually enjoy and play HDR games in the best possible manner, then you should actually do it in an almost pitch black room. And that is that. And I think, if there's enough interest, I will explore the ramifications of dynamic tone mapping and other HGIG options on the LG C10 or C9 OLEDs as well. But yes, I think, for this screen, I firmly believe that you should set it all the way to 0. There is no reason to set it above 0 unless you are consuming your HDR content in a non-reference environment. So another thing that I actually wanted to show you is that, let's say if I actually bump it up to the maximum value of code value 150, and you can see that it is fluctuating between 150 and 151. Now, this is because I'm actually using RGB full, which is the native output capability of the PS5 and also maybe this test screen as well. And some of you have been asking me why I keep recommending RGB range auto. It is because, I wanted to preserve RGB range full for games and then, keep YCBCR for movies. And if I actually go out here and go to the RGB range and change it to RGB range limited, right? So there's a flickering and then the HDMI handshake, and then we'll go into the adjust HDR screen again, and then we'll go to the last screen, and you can see that the values now fluctuate between 149 and 151, whereas previously when we were using RGB range full, it was only fluctuating between 150 and 151. And by using RGB limited, you are getting a wider spread. And sometimes I like a wider spread, but not this time. The reason why there is a wider spread is because, again, I stress that the PS5 is actually operating natively in RGB full, and by using RGB limited, there has to be some additional conversion going on, and therefore there will be more significant changes to the PQ digital code value. And even though it is not much, but if we can get a more consistent level of PQ code from the source, then it would always benefit the display in the sense that you're not subject to as much fluctuation, you're not subject to as much rounding errors and changes, because all these errors may be amplified further down the video processing line. So from that point of view, I still believe that RGB full is the correct way for the PS5 to be output to your display. And I think if you can do that manually, then obviously that is the best. Do RGB full for games and then YCBCR limited for movies. I don't care, if you are willing to go to such extent. But I think, most displays, hopefully, their auto detection will be good enough, and you can set it to auto and auto. And if I change this back to full, then I'll show you the screen again. And you can see that the fluctuations only range between 150 and 151, which is a slightly narrower spread than had we used RGB range limited. So I hope you have found this video useful. This again, I stress that these adjustments, I think engaging HGIG on your TV will make this much easier and much more accurate to adjust. Because let's say if you are not using HGIG, or you have a display that is not HGIG compliant, you may start clipping at level 2000 or even 4000 nits, when what the display is actually doing is actually tone mapping 4000 nits down to 1000 nits. So it's just really going to get messy. I see some people recommending switching off dynamic tone mapping and then engaging HGIG. That is probably one of the most futile attempts at calibration, so to speak. And maybe again, if there's interest, I'll show you the effects of actually doing that. So for this screen to work properly and correctly, you should engage HGIG, and then depending on what you really want, you should hard clip it or make it barely visible in terms of the sun or the symbol. And I think the reason why Sony has gone for the instructions of adjusting the brightness until the symbol is barely visible is because none of their TVs have an HGIG setting that disables the tone mapping completely. So only the LG TVs, the Samsung TVs, and I think the Vizio TVs. I have a TCL TV here. I haven't actually checked it out. I didn't have time to check it out, but I'll check it and see whether there is an HGIG option there or not. But I know for sure that Sony TVs don't have HGIG, which means that there will always be some tone mapping, and so you may end up setting the peak brightness slightly higher, in fact much higher, depending on the tone mapping algorithm than what the screen actually demands. So I hope you found this video useful. If you would like to watch some of our other videos on next-gen consoles, including the PS5 and Xbox Series X, I have created a playlist here if you'd like to click on it, and I will see you in the next video.